So I just watched the AMD Zen 3 announcement. It was about half an hour, so it was a very reasonable amount of time. I got some notes, so we'll get into the press conference in a moment, but overall, I kind of have conflicting feelings about it. Phone. I kind of have conflicting feelings about the conference. At first, I was a little bit disappointed, but now that I've had time to stew on it, I'm feeling a little bit better about it. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But one thing that you should know is that there was a lot of hype going into this conference. People were very, very excited about these new CPUs and what AMD was going to deliver. I was too. I just thought that we were going to get more than we did, but once you take those expectations away, it starts to make sense. So let's get into the conference, and we'll talk about it. So they start out with all the engineers coming and talking about it's like a recording of the engineers talking about how awesome AMD is, and how we kind of got to where we are now with the whole Ryzen thing, and they talk about the previous Ryzen launches. They show clips of Lisa announcing the previous Ryzen chips. 2018, I think, was Ryzen 2 or whatever. So then that is just kind of a reel that ends. Then Lisa comes out on stage, and she talks about how awesome it is that the Ryzen is powering the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. How awesome those consoles are and how much they love working with Microsoft and Sony. One thing that she mentions that's interesting is she talks about the first gen Ryzen, and I wrote this down because I thought it was funny. She says she knew that they wouldn't get there in one step with the Ryzen first gen. I'm like, that's a big understatement. The first gen Ryzen was pretty underwhelming when you compare it to what we have nowadays. It's really just not, a thing anymore. So I thought that was funny. She acknowledges that, the first gen Ryzen's kind of become obsolete in a way. I thought that was interesting. And then we finally get to Zen 3, and this guy, I don't know his last name, his name is Mark. He comes out, talks about Zen 3. And the first thing he says is that it's official, they have the best single-threaded performance. And one of the things that he said probably to support that was that significant IPC uplift, up to 19%. Which, on paper, sounds pretty good. And he talks about the new layout of chiplets and like the cache structure. It's like, how did they mention it? It was like a pool of cache or something like that. They mentioned that several times. Go back and look at that. I forgot I mentioned it, but that was a point that he wanted to make. And they just kind of talked about their whole engineering and design process, which is good, but we came here for numbers. So let's get some numbers, right? One of the things I did mention was the power efficiency. They said that Zen 3 is 2.8 times more efficient than a 10900K, which I think is like the i9, the top of the line for Intel right now. So that's interesting. Good to hear that we're going to have some energy efficient chips coming. And then Lisa comes back out, and she introduces the Ryzen 9 5900X. 12 cores, 24 threads, 4.8 gigahertz boost at 105 TDP. So that's pretty impressive. That is a significant uplift over what the previous 3900X was. I wrote down the ones for comparison. We're looking at 4.6 gigahertz boost. So we got a 0.2 gigahertz increase between the generations. Not bad. Then they bring out a benchmark of Shadow of the Tomb Raider. They're running the in-game benchmark, which apparently is a good benchmark for CPU performance. I didn't know that. The 3900X was doing an average of 141 frames. The 5900X, 181 frames. So a 40 frame average increase, and this was at 1080p. I don't think they mentioned what GPU they were using, but it was interesting to see that nonetheless. But it does show, that IPC uplift does sound to be pretty accurate. How much of that was the IPC and how much of that was just them increasing the frequency? I'm not sure. We're going to have to wait for reviews to come out. And then this guy, Robert, comes out, and then he showed this graph, this really big graph of like a bunch of games, and it just showed how the Ryzen was beating the Intel in all of these games. They said that across all of their games, there was an average of 25% average frame rate increase at 1080p. Okay. Good, alright. But if you looked at that chart, on an individual level, I only think one or two of those games hit a double-digit increase over the Intel competitor. I think that most of them were just single-digit increases on the average number of frames. One thing that he mentioned that I wrote down was the same motherboard, so you get to keep your motherboard. I'm assuming you're going to have to do a BIOS update. Then they showed Cinebench. Apparently they use Cinebench. A Cinebench score for the 5900X versus the 10900K. That is a weird chip name to say. 5900X got 631. 10900K got 533. So it handily outdoes it, and I think that was a single-threaded performance. Or single-core performance, I should say. So not bad. Seeing the Ryzen being able to beat Intel, like the one thing that Intel has had over AMD this whole time was, that they've been, for the last, I think since Ryzen 2nd Gen, their multi-core performance has been better. But they've still lost to Intel with their single-core. And now we're seeing that, no, they win there too, if their numbers are to be believed. And then Lisa comes back out, and she reveals the lineup. The lineup that we're going to get. And this is kind of where I was initially a little bit disappointed. So I'm going to read you these numbers for all these chips, and then I'm going to talk about it. So we have the Ryzen 9 5900X. We got 12 cores, 24 threads, 3.7 base, 4.8 boost, at a price of $550. Ryzen 7 5800X, 8 cores, 16 threads, 3.8 base, 4.7 boost, $450. Ryzen 5 5600X, 6 cores, 12 threads, 3.7 base, 4.6 boost, $300. When they announced that, I looked over in the chat and I saw some guy post in there, $300 for an R5? I'm like, yeah, I had the same sentiment, $300 for a Ryzen 5 for a 6-core CPU. Yeah, it just did not make a lot of sense, but when I'm going to read you some more numbers, we'll show you how that actually does make a little bit of sense. So, then she announces when it's coming out. We have a launch date of November 5th this year. So, in less than a month, we're going to have these new chips. And then, she brought out, this is kind of like a mic drop, like a drum roll. She brings out the Ryzen 9 5950X. They're going to be the predecessor to the successor, I should say, to the 3950X. So here we go. 16 cores, 32 threads, and a boost clock of 4.9. And I think it still has a 105 TDP, and that's going to sell for $800, and it's also coming out November 5th. That was pretty crazy. So all 4 of these chips are going to be coming out at the same time. That's awesome. So yeah, everyone in chat was actually really excited to see, you know, the 5950 get shown, and I think that's going to draw up a lot of hype among consumers. So then after all 4 of these chips are, you know, revealed, she then goes into talking about how compiling, CAD, video rendering, all that stuff is better, but it was already better before. We'll get to that in a moment. And then she kind of teases Big Navi, which is what they're calling their new GPU lineup. Now, this is something that I have been interested in for quite a while, because I have been waiting to see what AMD's response is going to be to NVIDIA's new RTX 3000 series. And I wanted to see what they're going to be bringing to the table. Well, she says October 28th is going to be the big reveal for Big Navi, so very excited for that. One thing that they did do, they did a kind of a I'm not really going to say a benchmark, but they kind of showed, they combined Zen 3 with their Big Navi, is what they're calling it, and they did a test clip in Borderlands 3. I didn't know Borderlands 3 was like a good benchmarking game, but they showed 4K over 60 frames. So, good. Big Navi's going to be able to do 4K, at least. Okay. Sounds good. And that's just kind of where they ended it off with, you know, kind of teasing their new GPU lineup, and that will be October 28th. So, that was the press conference. It was 30 minutes. It was pretty short. So, let's talk about the CPU lineup and what I think of it, what I initially thought, and what I'm thinking now. Because it's a lot to take in, and my thoughts are kind of all over the place. So, let's talk about this initial lineup of chips. So, the only tangible thing that you're going to see when you compare charts to the 3000 series is the 0.2 gigahertz boost across the board. And that's nice, but they're asking $50 more for these chips. The price isn't even the same as the previous gen. Now, what you could say is, well, that also comes with almost a 20% increase in IPC. Yeah, but how tangible is that IPC going to be? And we can't really answer that until we see these benchmarked in applications. We're going to have to see how that IPC is going to be used in-game, in, you know, realistic workloads when these chips come out. So I think that's too early to say, but if that's not a factor, if we're not talking IPC, I can't justify a reason to tell a 3000 series owner to rush out and go buy a 5000 series. It just does not seem worth it, in all honesty. I mean, for comparison, I have the 3000 series right here. 3900X, we have a boost clock of 4.6, $500. 3800X, 4.5, $400. 3600X, 4.4, $250. It's just, I just not enough there, not enough meat on the bone for me to say a 5000 series is going to be a better path forward than the 3000 series. Now, if you're on an older chip, if you're on, you know, a first-gen Ryzen or like an older Intel and you don't really care about branding, then yeah, I'm going to tell you to get a 5000 series all day long. I mean, just from what they were showing in that increase in frames for their game chart, the increase that a 5000 series is going to bring is going to be great. And I can very much recommend to you that if you're on an older platform and you need to upgrade. I mean, there are still countless people who are still on DDR3 platforms. They haven't even broken into the DDR4 RAM world yet. And I think that started back in, like, what, 2016 or something? So, you know, if that's the case, this 5000 series is going to be a great introduction there. They're just a little bit pricey. But one thing that I think we should consider, and I didn't really think about this until afterward, is that this 5000 series is going to cause the 3000 series to go down. And that's something to consider, because the 3000 series is a great lineup at great prices. So having those prices go even lower with these new products hitting the market is going to be awesome. So I think I would probably be less likely to say, hey, drop what you're doing and go out and buy a 5000 series, and I might say, drop what you're doing, go get a cheap 3000 series. I think that would be, a lot more realistic of what I would tell people. So I think that is the kind of the silver lining. But one thing I wanted to bring to your attention of why I can understand how this increase in price makes sense is, so the R5 5600X, it starts at 3.7 base clock to a 4.6 boost clock for $300, right? Compare that to the i7 8700K, okay? You remember that chip? The 6-core, 12 threads, top-of-the-line Coffee Lake processor? That one started at 3.7 base, just like this R5, to a 4.7 boost on single core. This one is 4.6. And that was $360. So when you think of this Ryzen 5, the 5600X, if you think about it less as a Ryzen 5 and more of a Coffee Lake 8700K for $60 cheaper, then that when you look at it through that lens, it starts to make more sense, you see. So in that way, I can kind of see how it makes sense to price that way. So that's just something to consider. I didn't go through and compare the rest of them to whatever their Intel counterparts would be. I don't really see the point at the moment. We're going to see that when benchmarks come out. One thing that was very prevalent among everyone in the chat, though, was how disappointed they were that AMD did not break the 5 gigahertz barrier. And to that end, I gotta say I really didn't care. I was more so for price to performance, rather than the whole enthusiast 5 gigahertz, all that nonsense. So that didn't really affect me much, but they did say that Zen 4, which will be 5 nanometer, is in development. They did not give a release date for it, but it is on the way. So at the end of the day, we're going to have to wait for numbers to come out. But I think that this launch is going to be a successful launch. I think these CPUs are going to kick butt. The question that I was just asking is, will these CPUs be worth it to people who have 3000 series Ryzen chips? That was kind of the market, because they were tailoring that. The way that they were talking in the conference was this is going to replace your Ryzen 3000. And just looking at the numbers they presented, and this is AMD presenting their own chips, so those numbers are probably looked at through rose-colored glasses a little bit, if you know what I mean. I just did not see, if it were me, I just did not see compelling enough numbers to where I would drop my 3000 for a 5000. I just didn't see them. The increase in clock is nice, but the biggest thing was that increase in IPC. But we're just going to have to measure that when it comes out. I still think it's too early to say. But overall, I think it was a very good conference. I think they showcased, what these chips can do very well. The biggest point was that AMD, they're now beating Intel in single-core performance. I don't remember the last time that was, but this is a big deal. And I think that these chips are going to be pretty groundbreaking, and I think that the enthusiasts might have to switch over from Intel to AMD. But, again, we're going to have to see in November when the products hit the shelves. Don't wait for reviewer benchmarks, wait for consumer benchmarks. You'll be able to see some actual, real numbers from real people. But, yeah. So, yeah, this is exciting, because even if you're not going to get a 5000 series, people who ditch their 2000 series and 3000 series for these, those chips are going to be on eBay for cheaper. and that's going to be great. So, you know, it's an exciting time all around, and yeah, it was a very good conference. So that's pretty much all I had to say about that. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, because this is still a lot to process, and you know, we're gonna have to kind of go around and see what the community thinks as a whole. Let me know what you think. If you like the video, like and subscribe, and yeah, thanks for watching.